The morning sun poured through the old cabin's windows, painting long golden lines across the wooden floor. The place was quiet, peaceful and tucked deep inside the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It was the kind of quiet that most people would find lonely, but for him it was a gift. For years he had lived with noise. Engines roaring, orders shouted, bullets cutting the air. Silence was something he had once dreamed of. Now it was his home. He woke early every day, long before sunrise. It was a habit that never left him. No matter how much time had passed since his military days, the world was still dark when he sat on the porch with a mug of coffee in his hand. The stars above were fading and the horizon glowed faintly. At his feet lay Thor, his dog, breathing softly, his head resting on the wooden floorboards. The big German shepherd was not just a pet. He was family. Thor had been with him for 8 years, ever since their last deployment together. The two had shared everything: missions, danger, exhaustion, and survival. When the time came for both of them to leave the service, he couldn't imagine going home without the dog who had saved his life more than once. The bond between them wasn't something words could describe. It was built through trust, fear, and the quiet moments between chaos. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the steam rising in the crisp morning air. Thor stirred and looked up at him, tail giving a lazy wag. "Morning, buddy," he said softly. His voice was rough but warm. The dog stood, stretched, and leaned against his leg. There was no need for words between them. They understood each other perfectly. After breakfast, the man grabbed a small backpack and clipped a leash onto Thor's collar, though he rarely needed it. They walked the trail behind the cabin, a narrow path that led through pine trees and wild grass. The smell of dew and earth filled the air. Birds sang somewhere far off. The man liked these walks. They reminded him that peace didn't have to feel empty. He had bought this land after leaving the service. It wasn't much, a modest wooden house, a workshop, and a few acres of forest. But it was enough. Enough space to breathe, to think, and to heal. He didn't talk much to people from town, though everyone knew of him in vague ways. To them, he was just a quiet man who lived alone with his big dog. They didn't know what he had done or what he had seen. He preferred it that way. He wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted a life that didn't demand anything from him anymore. Thor ran ahead now and then, chasing a squirrel or following a scent. The man smiled faintly each time, though he never said much. He had learned that the best things in life often didn't need words. Sometimes silence carried more meaning than conversation ever could. When they reached the lake, the man threw a stick into the water. Thor dove in, strong and graceful, splashing and swimming with joy. Watching him, the man felt something he hadn't felt in years, a simple kind of happiness. He sat on a rock by the shore and watched his dog swim under the rising sun. Life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. And for him, that was enough. Later, they returned to the cabin where the man worked on small projects, fixing furniture, carving wood, or repairing tools. He liked working with his hands. It kept his mind steady. The military had taught him precision and focus, and now he used those same skills for quiet, ordinary things. Thor would lie nearby, eyes half closed, keeping watch in his own way. Sometimes, when night fell, memories would visit him, the kind he couldn't escape no matter how much time had passed. Faces of people he had served with, the noise of battle, the split-second decisions that changed everything. He had lost friends, good people, and though he had survived, there were nights he wondered if he really had left that world behind. But then Thor would nudge his hand, reminding him of the present. The warmth of a living creature grounded him, brought him back. He owed more to that dog than anyone could imagine. Once a week, he drove into town for supplies. The trip was simple: groceries, fuel, dog food. People were polite but distant. They didn't know much about him, and he didn't offer much either. He liked it that way, but he noticed things, how people avoided Thor at first sight. The dog's size and sharp eyes made strangers uneasy. Some kids liked him, but adults tended to keep their distance. It didn't bother him much. Thor was gentle unless given a reason not to be. The man knew that better than anyone. There was one afternoon when a small boy dropped his ice cream outside the general store. Thor walked up and sat near him, waiting quietly. The boy giggled and reached out to pet him. The dog leaned in, patient and kind. The man smiled faintly, watching from a few feet away. But when the boy's mother came out, she pulled him back quickly, eyes wide with fear. "Don't touch that dog," she said sharply. Thor stepped back obediently. The man said nothing, only gave a polite nod and walked away. He didn't blame her. People feared what they didn't understand. Back home, life went on the same way. Early mornings, quiet afternoons, long walks, and peaceful nights. But underneath the calm, the man always sensed a thin line between his world and the rest of society. He knew how quickly peace could vanish, how fast something good could be taken away. It was a lesson life had taught him many times. He had trained hundreds of soldiers during his career, had seen things that most people would never believe. But the hardest lesson was this: even heroes don't get to control everything. Life doesn't care about rank or medals. It gives and takes on its own terms. He had accepted that, or at least he thought he had. One evening he sat by the porch with a book in hand, the sound of crickets filling the air. Thor was lying nearby, head resting on his paws. The sky above was turning orange and pink, and the air carried that soft chill that comes before nightfall. It was moments like these that he treasured most, the small, ordinary beauty of stillness. He thought about the years that had led him here. He had been 20 when he joined the service, full of purpose and drive. Over time, the missions grew more dangerous, the stakes higher. But he had never hesitated. When he was chosen for Delta Force, he had felt both pride and weight. It was the highest honor, but it also meant living a life of secrecy and sacrifice. His work had taken him across continents, through deserts, jungles, and war-torn cities. He had operated in places most people only saw in news headlines. And through it all, Thor had been there, trained, loyal, unshakable. The dog had saved his life during one mission in a dusty village halfway across the world. They had been ambushed, cornered in a narrow alley. The enemy had come fast. Thor had leapt into action, knocking one down, giving him the split second he needed to react. He never forgot that moment. From that day forward, they were inseparable. When he finally returned home, he fought through the paperwork to make sure Thor could retire with him. It wasn't easy, but he wasn't the kind of man to give up easily. He had made a promise that day, to give Thor the peaceful life he deserved. And he had kept it. The two of them built a rhythm that worked. They didn't need many people. They didn't need noise, just space, quiet, and trust. The man had found that the hardest battles weren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they were fought inside one's own head, and Thor had become his anchor through it all. As night deepened, he set his book aside and looked at the stars. "We did good, didn't we?" he said softly. Thor's ears twitched. The dog turned his head slightly as if listening. "You've earned this peace more than I have," the man continued. Thor's tail brushed against the porch gently. For a moment, everything felt right in the world. A soft wind rustled the trees. The man leaned back, feeling a quiet gratitude that he rarely expressed out loud. Life had been hard on him, but it had also given him something pure. In Thor, he had found loyalty that didn't need words, and in the quiet woods, he had found a kind of freedom no metal could ever give. That night, as the moonlight spilled through the window, Thor lay beside his bed, breathing softly. The man watched him for a while before falling asleep. There was peace in knowing that for now they were safe. The world outside might still be complicated, still filled with noise and confusion, but here in this small cabin things made sense. It was a fragile kind of peace, but it was real. The man didn't know that soon this simple life would be disrupted. He didn't know that one small misunderstanding could take everything from him. For now he only knew the sound of steady breathing beside him, the warmth of trust and the comfort of silence. He had no reason to expect that this would change. Not yet. In the days that followed, everything seemed as it always had been. The morning walks, the quiet meals, the evenings spent by the fire. Thor grew older, but his spirit remained strong. He still chased squirrels with the same energy, still greeted his owner with the same joy each morning. The man sometimes thought about how different his life would have been without him. He didn't like to imagine it, and so the days passed, each one blending into the next like pages in a peaceful book. The man had no need for the past anymore. He had done his duty. He had fought his wars. All he wanted now was to live quietly with his companion, away from the world that once demanded so much of him. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The peace he had worked so hard to build was about to be tested, and when it happened, it wouldn't be in the way he expected. It wouldn't come with noise or warning. It would come quietly, from a place that should have been safe. For now, though, he didn't know that. He simply leaned against the porch railing as the sun dipped below the trees, a soft breeze carrying the scent of pine through the air. Thor sat beside him, loyal as ever. In that moment, they were two souls at rest, unaware that the world beyond their woods was already beginning to turn against them. The week began like any other. The man woke early, brewed his coffee, and sat on the porch while the forest slowly came alive. Thor rested by his side, calm and content. The same quiet rhythm continued, the kind of life that didn't ask for much but gave peace in return. That morning, he decided to head into town earlier than usual. The pantry was running low and Thor needed a new bag of food. The drive to town took about 30 minutes, winding through country roads and open fields. The man liked this drive. It gave him time to think, though he didn't think about much these days. Mostly he thought about small things, the weather, his next wood project, or what trail he and Thor might explore on the weekend. Thor watched from the passenger seat, ears perked, his head close to the open window. Every time they passed a field, his nose twitched at the scent of grass and dust. The man smiled slightly at the sight. The dog's joy was pure. In a world that often felt complicated, Thor was simple and honest. They stopped by the supply store first. The man picked up groceries, a bag of nails, and a few tools he needed. Then he went to the pet store on the corner where the owner always had treats ready for Thor. The man set the bag of food on the counter while Thor sat patiently beside him. The owner smiled and tossed a small biscuit toward the dog, who caught it with ease. "He's a good one," the store owner said. "He's the best," the man replied quietly. It was a short trip, no more than an hour, but by the time they returned home, the afternoon sun had grown warm. The man parked near the cabin, unloaded the bags, and let Thor roam freely around the yard. The woods were safe and Thor never wandered far. Later that day, a new neighbor moved into a house down the road. The man had seen the moving truck earlier while driving back. It wasn't common for people to move into that area. It was mostly old land, quiet and spaced out. He didn't think much of it. People came and went all the time. The next morning, he and Thor followed their usual routine: the long walk by the lake, breakfast on the porch, and a few hours of quiet work in the shed. Around noon, he heard voices near the property line. Laughter, footsteps, the sound of a child playing. It must have been the new neighbors. He didn't mind. It was good to hear life around again. Thor heard it too. His ears lifted and he looked toward the sound. The man patted his head. "It's okay, buddy," he said softly. "They're just playing." The dog stayed calm, though alert. His instincts always sharp. Over the next few days, the man noticed the neighbors more often, a young couple and their small son around 5 or 6 years old. They seemed kind, waving whenever they saw him on the road. The boy was curious and energetic, often chasing butterflies or exploring near the trees. One afternoon, while the man was chopping wood, Thor trotted off toward the fence line. The man saw the little boy there, kneeling by the grass. Thor approached slowly, tail wagging, curious. The boy laughed and held out his hand. The man started walking over, not worried. Thor was gentle with children. But before he reached them, the boy's mother came running from the house, shouting the child's name. She grabbed the boy quickly and glared toward Thor. "Don't go near that dog," she said, her voice sharp with fear. Thor froze, confused. The man called him back calmly, and the dog returned immediately, sitting at his side. "He won't hurt anyone," the man said quietly. The woman looked uneasy. "He looks dangerous," she said, clutching her child's hand. "He's trained," the man replied. "He's a retired service dog." She didn't answer. She just nodded stiffly and walked back toward the house. The man sighed. Encounters like that weren't new. He understood why people felt uneasy. Thor was large, strong, and had that sharp, watchful gaze that came from years of training. But he also knew the truth. Thor was calm, disciplined, and deeply loyal. The next few days were quiet again, though the woman's reaction lingered in the man's mind. He didn't like being misunderstood, but he had learned not to take it personally. Then came the day that changed everything. It was late afternoon. The man had driven into town to pick up mail and supplies. He left Thor at home, something he rarely did, but it was only a short trip. The dog was safe inside the fenced yard with food, water, and shade. While he was gone, the new neighbor's boy had been playing with a ball near the fence. At some point, the ball rolled through the gate and into the yard. The boy, without thinking, slipped through the fence to get it. Thor noticed movement and approached, tail wagging, curious as ever. but to anyone who didn't know him, his size and speed could be frightening. The boy squealed, not from fear but surprise, and ran toward the gate. The mother, seeing him through the window, panicked. She thought the dog was chasing her son. She ran outside screaming, drawing the attention of another neighbor. Within minutes, someone had called animal control. By the time the man returned home, the damage was already done. 2 animal control trucks were parked by his property along with a patrol car. Officers stood near the gate, talking to the woman who lived next door. The man parked his truck confused and stepped out slowly. Thor was sitting calmly near the porch, tail still, ears perked as if waiting for him. "What's going on?" the man asked, walking toward them. One of the officers turned to him. "Sir, are you the owner of this dog?" "Yes," the man said. "What's this about?" "We got a report that your dog acted aggressively toward a child," the officer replied. The man frowned. "That's not possible." "My dog doesn't hurt anyone." The neighbor stepped forward quickly.
"He chased my son,"
she said, her voice shaking. "He could have attacked him." "He didn't," the man said firmly, though still calm. "Thor doesn't attack. He probably went to play." But the officers didn't seem convinced. One of them moved closer to Thor, who stood alert now, sensing tension. The man raised his hand slightly. "Please don't come too close." He's calm, but he reacts to strangers moving fast. "Sir, we're going to have to take the dog for evaluation," one officer said. "What do you mean, take him?" the man asked quietly. "It's standard procedure for reported aggression cases. It'll only be temporary," the officer said. The man's jaw tightened. He didn't do anything wrong. "I understand, sir, but we have to follow protocol." The man could see there was no point arguing right then. He nodded slowly and turned to Thor. The dog looked up at him, trusting, waiting for a command. The man knelt down and stroked his fur. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered. "Go with them. I'll come get you soon." Thor's ears flicked, and after a moment he followed the officers without protest. The man watched the truck pull away, his chest tight. Something inside him felt wrong, a quiet warning that this wasn't as simple as they made it sound. But he tried to calm himself. They said it was just procedure. He would go down tomorrow, explain everything, and bring Thor home. That night the house felt empty. The silence was heavier than usual. He sat on the porch staring at the empty spot where Thor always lay. He couldn't sleep, couldn't settle. Every sound in the woods reminded him of his missing companion. Early the next morning he drove to the animal control center. The woman at the front desk looked at him with polite distance. "I'm here for my dog," he said. "German Shepherd, brought in yesterday from Pinewood Road." She typed on her computer and hesitated. "One moment, sir." Minutes passed. She returned with another staff member, an older man who looked uncomfortable. "Sir," the older man began slowly. "There's been a development." The man's stomach dropped. "What kind of development?" The room seemed too quiet. The older man sighed. "Your dog was euthanized early this morning. There was a misunderstanding in the paperwork. It was marked as an immediate public safety case. The words didn't make sense at first. They sounded like a language from another world. Euthanized, he repeated softly, as if the word might change if spoken differently. "That's a mistake." The staff member looked down. "I'm truly sorry. It shouldn't have happened that way." The man didn't speak for a long moment. He felt something heavy sink into him. Not anger, not shock, just a kind of hollow silence. He turned slowly and walked out. The sunlight outside seemed unreal, too bright, too calm. The parking lot was empty except for his truck. He stood there for a long time, his hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. The drive home felt endless. Every mile stretched like a memory. The seat beside him, and where Thor usually sat, it was empty. He could still hear the sound of paws on the porch, the quiet breathing at night, but it was gone now. When he reached the cabin, the yard felt different. Still and unfamiliar, he walked to the porch and sat down the same way he always did in the mornings. The woods were quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet he loved. It was the kind that pressed against the heart. He looked at the bowl by the door, still half full of water. The leash hung from the hook. Everything was the same, but nothing was. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt something break inside. He didn't cry, he couldn't. He had spent a lifetime training himself not to. But the silence around him said everything that words couldn't. He didn't know yet that this was only the beginning. He didn't know that the quiet man the authorities had dismissed was someone far more capable than they realized. He didn't know that soon the world would learn who he really was, and that his fight wasn't over. For now, he only sat there in the stillness, remembering the one friend who had never failed him, the one the world had taken away without understanding what they had done. And as the sun set behind the trees, the peaceful cabin that once felt like home now felt like a place haunted by absence, the kind of silence that doesn't heal, the kind that demands to be answered. The morning after Thor was gone, the house felt different in a way the man couldn't explain. It was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet he loved. It was the kind that pressed down on him heavy and cold. The world outside went on as usual. Birds still sang. The wind still moved through the trees but for him, everything had changed. He sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the empty space where Thor used to rest. The bowl by the door was still there. The leash hung where it always did. He hadn't touched anything. He couldn't. Every time he looked at those things, it felt like a reminder of something that had been stolen, not lost. All his life, he had learned how to keep calm under pressure. He had been trained to stay focused no matter the chaos around him. He had faced danger, fear, and loss, but this felt different. It was quiet and invisible, the kind of pain that didn't show on the outside. He drove into town later that day not because he wanted to, but because he needed answers. He parked outside the small building with the words Animal Services written in fading paint. The same woman from before sat at the desk. She looked up and her face changed when she recognized him. "I told you yesterday," she began softly. "We're very sorry about what happened." The man didn't raise his voice. "Sorry doesn't bring him back." She lowered her eyes. "It was a mistake. The paperwork was marked wrong. It shouldn't have happened. Then why did it?" She hesitated. There was confusion about the report. It was listed as an urgent case. Once it's processed under that category, the procedure moves fast. Who filed it as urgent? "I can't say for sure," she said quietly. "It came from the local police report. Someone classified it as a threat case." He stood there for a long moment, silent. He wasn't angry in the way most people imagined anger. His was a colder kind, quiet, steady, focused. The kind that didn't shout but stayed alive for a long time. "Can I see the report?" he asked. The woman hesitated. "It's not public record." He leaned forward slightly. "You made it public the moment you killed my dog without asking a single question." Something in his tone made her step back. She didn't feel threatened, but she felt the weight of his words. She looked around, then lowered her voice. "If you come back tomorrow, I might be able to get you a copy. But you didn't hear that from me." He nodded once, then turned and walked out. That night he sat at the kitchen table, the report from his own memory running through his mind. He had seen mistakes before. He had seen systems fail. But what bothered him most was how easily it had happened. How quickly a life could be erased because someone didn't care enough to double-check a form. He thought about Thor, about the loyalty, the years of service, the trust they had shared. To most people, he was just a dog. But to him, Thor had been his partner, his family. The next day, he returned to the office. The same woman handed him a thin file, her expression uneasy. "I shouldn't be giving you this," she whispered. "Please don't tell anyone." He nodded, took the file, and left without a word. Back home, he opened it on the table. The report was short and 2 pages. He read every line carefully. The words aggressive animal, potential danger to child stood out. Then he saw the signature at the bottom, the local police officer who had responded that day. The same one who had promised it was just procedure. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the paper. A mistake didn't feel like the truth anymore. It felt like someone wanted the situation to go away quickly. He didn't plan revenge. That wasn't who he was. But he did want truth. And he knew how to find it. His years in Delta Force had taught him more than how to fight. They had taught him how to see patterns, how to track information, and how to uncover what others wanted hidden. He started small. He visited the neighbor's house the next afternoon. The woman opened the door, her face tight with guilt and fear. The boy peeked out from behind her legs. "I'm not here to argue," he said quietly. "I just want to understand what happened." The woman shifted uncomfortably. "My son went into your yard," she admitted. He dropped his ball. "The dog came running and I panicked. I thought he was going to hurt him. Did he? She hesitated. No, she said finally. He didn't. He never touched him. He nodded slowly. Then why did you say he attacked? I didn't, she said quickly. I told the officer he ran toward my son. I never said attack. The man looked at her for a moment, then gave a short nod. Thank you. He turned and left, his mind working quietly. The woman wasn't lying. He could read people. Years of experience had taught him how to spot fear, guilt, and truth. And what he saw in her eyes wasn't deceit. It was regret. So if she hadn't said attack, who had written it that way? He went home and began making calls. Quiet ones to old friends who still worked in government or law enforcement. He didn't mention names, just asked about process and paperwork. Bit by bit, he pieced together how reports could be changed. It didn't take much. One word added, one box checked wrong, one person signing off without reading. Days turned into weeks. The world outside moved on, but he couldn't. Each morning, he still made 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one he poured into Thor's bowl, a small ritual he couldn't give up. It wasn't about superstition. It was about memory. He began writing things down on times, names, details. He visited the police station, requesting the full incident report. The officer on duty recognized him and shifted uncomfortably when he saw the name on the file. You were there that day? The man said quietly. You told me it was just procedure. It was, the officer replied. I didn't know they'd act that fast. Then who did? The officer hesitated. I filed the report. It was reviewed by the department head. He signed the urgency request. Why? Because of the complaint. It said immediate threat. The man looked straight at him. Who changed it to that? The officer didn't answer. His silence said enough. The man turned and walked out again, calm and deliberate. On the way home, his mind was quiet but clear. He had spent years following trails through war zones, tracking men who hid in shadows. This was no different, except now the fight wasn't for a mission. It was for truth. He didn't need weapons or force. He had something stronger: discipline, patience, and the ability to read people better than they could read him. He began gathering information, public records, complaints, and reports of similar cases. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. The same department had a history of rushed decisions, missing paperwork, and questionable euthanasia cases. Most people never challenged it. They didn't have the time, money, or courage to fight back. But he wasn't most people. At night, he sat at his desk surrounded by papers, his lamp casting a soft glow over notes and folders. The quiet tick of the clock was the only sound. Each detail he uncovered brought him closer to understanding how easily one mistake could destroy something innocent. He wasn't angry for himself anymore. He was angry for everyone who had lost something unfairly. A month later, he reached out to an old friend, a journalist who used to cover military affairs. The man sent him copies of his findings. I think you'll want to see this, he said over the phone, his voice steady. The journalist called back 2 days later. This isn't a mistake, he said quietly. This is a pattern, and if we expose it, it'll make noise. Good, the man replied. Let's make sure it's the right kind of noise. They worked quietly, carefully. Every claim was checked, every document verified. The story grew, not about one man and his dog, but about a system that had failed too many. Through it all, the man stayed calm. He didn't speak about his military background. He didn't talk about his past or his rank. None of that mattered. What mattered was truth, and the promise he had made to Thor long ago, to protect him no matter what. When the article was finally published, it spread faster than anyone expected. Headlines called it "The Quiet Veteran Who Exposed the Truth." People began asking questions. Local officials scrambled to respond. Investigations were launched. The man never appeared on television, never gave interviews. He stayed in his cabin, away from the noise, but he read every word. And for the first time since Thor's death, he felt something like peace. Not happiness, and that would never return, but peace in knowing that his companion's life had meant something beyond loss. Late one evening, he walked down to the lake where he and Thor had once spent mornings together. The water reflected the soft light of the moon. He knelt by the shore and set a small wooden carving in the sand, a likeness of Thor he had made by hand. He didn't speak for a while. Then in a low voice he said, "You didn't die for nothing." The night was calm. A breeze moved across the water. He stood there, eyes fixed on the reflection of the sky, his thoughts quiet but steady. He knew the fight wasn't over yet. There were still hearings, still questions, still resistance from those who didn't want change. But he had started something, and he wouldn't stop until it was finished. The man who once lived in silence had found his voice again, not through anger or revenge, but through truth. And somewhere deep in the quiet woods, the spirit of loyalty that Thor had embodied seemed to live on, not in body, but in purpose. For the first time in a long while, the man looked up at the stars and felt something shift inside him. It wasn't closure, it was strength. Quiet, unbreakable strength. And though the world still didn't know who he truly was, those who did would soon learn. The quiet man they had underestimated was once the fiercest leader Delta Force ever had. And this time, his mission was justice. Days passed slowly after the story broke. The man didn't expect attention, but attention came anyway. The small town that once barely noticed him now whispered his name in grocery aisles and on street corners. People who had seen him as just the quiet man with the big dog now looked at him differently. Some looked with respect, others with curiosity, but he didn't care about any of that. All he wanted was to make sure what happened to Thor would never happen again. He kept to himself, working quietly at home, answering occasional calls from reporters through his journalist friend. They were careful with every word, never using his full name, never revealing details of his past. The article had focused on the injustice, not on who he used to be. That was how he wanted it. He wasn't looking for fame, only for truth. Still, as the weeks went by, he could tell that his story had caused a stir far beyond what he expected. People started writing letters, strangers who had lost pets unfairly, families who had been silenced by complicated laws or ignored complaints. He kept the letters in a box, each one reminding him that he wasn't alone in his fight. He read them in the evenings, sitting on the porch as the sun went down. Some letters were written in neat handwriting, others in rushed scrawls, but they all carried the same message: pain, confusion, and the wish for justice. He started keeping notes, collecting details, and reaching out to a few of the people who had written to him. He listened to their stories, carefully, respectfully. Most of them didn't expect anything to change, but he told them quietly, "It will." He meant it. At first, he didn't plan on taking it further. He thought maybe the article would be enough, that the exposure would push authorities to fix what was broken. But as time passed, it became clear that some people wanted the story to disappear. Calls to the journalists slowed down. Requests for documents started being delayed or misplaced. A few local officials began saying the whole thing was exaggerated. It was a familiar pattern. He had seen it before, just in a different world. When people in power felt cornered, they didn't always face the truth. They tried to bury it. He realized he couldn't let that happen. One afternoon, he sat at his table surrounded by papers, his coffee untouched. Sunlight streamed through the window, highlighting the edges of old photographs and notes. He flipped through the documents one by one, marking connections, cross-checking dates, and writing down names. It was slow work, but he didn't mind. He had done harder things. He reached out quietly to a few trusted contacts, people who still worked in federal investigation offices, people who remembered him from his old life but didn't ask too many questions. He didn't tell them everything, only what they needed to know. One of them called back a few days later. "You've got something real here," the voice said. "We've seen complaints about that department before. Your case might be the one that finally pushes it open." That night he sat outside under the stars. The air was cool, the forest calm. He looked toward the place where Thor used to rest and said softly, "We're not done yet." The next few weeks were filled with quiet movement. Files were shared, meetings were held, and slowly a small team began to investigate. The man didn't lead it publicly. He stayed behind the scenes, feeding information, verifying records, making sure every fact was solid. He wanted no room for denial. He didn't seek revenge against the officers or the officials who made the mistake. He only wanted accountability, a change that would protect others. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized how deep the negligence went. It wasn't just one office or one bad decision. It was a chain of laziness, carelessness, and people signing papers without reading them. Lives had been lost at not just pets, but trust, dignity, and fairness. The man didn't sleep much during that time. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night and walk out to the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. Those were the moments when he missed Thor the most. He remembered how Thor would rest his head on his knee whenever he sensed tension. It had been his way of reminding him to breathe, to slow down. The man smiled faintly at the memory, then looked up at the stars. "You'd like this, buddy," he whispered. "You always did like order." As the investigation continued, news began to spread again. More people came forward sharing their stories. Local papers picked up on the movement. It wasn't just one man's loss anymore. It was a call for reform. When federal agents finally announced an official audit of the county's animal control division, the man sat quietly in his kitchen, listening to the announcement on the radio. The voice on the broadcast said the investigation was being launched due to credible evidence of misconduct and failure to follow legal procedures. He didn't smile or cheer. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and said, "Good." Not long after, reporters began camping near the town. They wanted interviews, quotes, reactions. The man avoided them all. He didn't want the spotlight. He didn't want people to focus on him. He wanted them to focus on the issue, the system that needed change. One evening, as he was returning from a short walk by the lake, a car pulled up near his gate. A young reporter stepped out holding a small notebook. "Sir, I just wanted to ask, why did you keep pushing this when most people would have given up?" He looked at her for a moment, then said simply, "Because he would have done the same for me." That was all he said before walking inside. Over the following months, the investigation deepened. Documents were uncovered showing that several dogs had been euthanized under false classifications. Officials resigned quietly. Policies were rewritten. The man followed it all from afar, sitting on his porch with the newspaper folded neatly in his hands. People started calling what he did justice. But for him, it wasn't about justice or recognition. It was about balance, about doing what was right, even when no one was watching. The state's governor eventually signed a reform bill, one that required all public safety animal cases to be reviewed by multiple officials before any decision could be made. It was small, but it was a start. The new law didn't carry Thor's name at first, but a few months later, after more petitions and public support, it was renamed Thor's Law. When the man read those words printed in the newspaper, he sat very still for a long time. His eyes lingered on the name. He could almost see Thor's face, calm, loyal, and full of that quiet strength that had always steadied him. He set the paper down and went outside. The forest around him glowed in the soft light of the evening. Birds moved through the branches, and somewhere far off, a stream whispered over rocks. He walked to the edge of the lake and stood there, watching the reflection of the sky ripple in the water. For the first time in many months, the quiet didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt peaceful again, the way it had before everything changed. He sat on the same rock where he and Thor used to rest after their walks. The wind brushed against his face, and he closed his eyes. He thought about the years he had spent in the military, the people he had served with, and the missions he had led. All of it had felt important at the time, but this simple fight for fairness, felt different. It felt deeper. He realized something then. All his life he had been trained to protect people, freedom, peace. But what he had done now was something quieter. He had protected compassion. He whispered softly, "We did it, buddy." The world had changed just a little bit, not enough to erase the pain, but enough to honor what they had shared. A few weeks later, he received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a letter from the state office thanking him for his efforts and persistence in bringing about change. There was also a bronze tag engraved with the words, "In memory of Thor for loyalty and courage beyond words." He placed it on the shelf beside Thor's old collar. For a long time, he just stood there staring at it. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt whole in a quiet, unspoken way. From then on, his days slowly returned to a peaceful rhythm. He still took his morning walks, still sat by the porch with coffee, still listened to the wind in the trees. But something in him had softened, not from weakness, but from understanding. He had learned that real strength wasn't in what you could fight or destroy. It was in what you could protect, what you could preserve. And though he never told anyone, sometimes late at night when the world outside was perfectly still, he swore he could hear the faint sound of paws on the wooden porch, the echo of a life that would always be part of him. The man smiled in the darkness, not out of sadness, but gratitude. Some bonds, he realized, never truly end. They just change form, from flesh to memory, from Sue